Hey, and with that ever so smooth move, welcome back to Storytime with Nate. It's not even really in the place. That'll do it. That's just about it. Cool. So yeah, welcome back. We are still reading Headhunters of the Amazon. I think we finished the last chapter. They had gotten their hands on some anteater, were quite hungry, and it turns out you don't want to eat that. They were violently ill. Then the kayak fucking went off down the river. Jack disappeared off, and our author thought he was gone for dead, and then Jack shows up again. That was the end of the chapter. So here we are, on to chapter 10. I feel like we should celebrate this landmark. Maybe cider for the next chapter. I'm going to do a couple of chapters in a row today, I'm hoping, because it took so long between the last two. Try catch up on that lost work, lost time and shit. So here we are anyway. Chapter 10, Highway Robbery. We would go to Iquitos. Of that there was no more doubt. I was no good for any more hard work. I could not pack myself along the trail, never mind rubber. The life which we had endured so long had become intolerable. Where we had been able to laugh, we could no longer smile. The pile of rubber looked like a passage to New York at last. For me, New York spelled family and friends, and for Jack, hot biscuits and butter. The canoe had been recovered. After a battle with the current, in which he had no paddle to help him, Jack had floated ashore on the left bank. How to get back exercised his mind for some time, but at last, giving it up as hopeless, he had set off on foot to find a spot where he could swim across, and so work up the right bank to camp. But night overtook him, and he lost his way in the dark, being compelled to sleep till dawn in his naked condition in the woods. Next day, he struck the river above camp, and made his way home as quickly as he could by one of our trails. After a few days, when the effects of the anteater had worn off a little, I went down river with him, and we fetched up the dugout. We lost no time then in stowing the rubber and the rest of our belongings on board and pushed off. That trip was characterized for the first 10 days by one thing only: the struggle to keep ourselves in food. The stores we had bought from Andrade being very nearly exhausted, we had to rely on the very sketchy supply of odds and ends which chance threw in our way. Once or twice they were worth having. We found, I remember, a rarity for those woods, the nest of a young aruru with 8 eggs. The eggs of this bird are sky blue, larger than a hen's, and make excellent eating. At times we gathered the fruit from a chontapam, a yellow mealy fruit, of the texture and more or less the taste of a roast chestnut. It is, by the way, the wood of this giant plant which is used by many of the upper Amazon tribes for the making of blowguns and spears. Sometimes, however, our hunger drove us to experiments which gave but poor results, to say the least of it. Once, for example, we tried a turkey buzzard, gallinazo in Spanish. They are the scavengers of the tropics. A fine used to be imposed in Colon for destroying any of these valuable units of the only sewage brigade in the town. Jack started to pluck it, but after removing a few feathers he handed it to me, saying I could have it all to myself. I carried on until it stood forth in all its beastly nakedness. I parboiled it, boiled it, fried it, reboiled it, and fried it again in monkey grease, until it was a stinking, filthy mess in the bottom of the pan. Then I gave up. There may be some chemical means of extracting the smell from a turkey buzzard, but I doubt it. After that, a dead hog which we found looked quite attractive. We didn't suppose that it much mattered whether it had been killed or just died, so long as we boiled it. So we cut off a hind leg and took it back to camp. It was very high. We boiled it. The maggots were better than the meat. But we had better luck with the water snake, which we managed to shoot as it swam by the dugout. The fried flesh tasted like eel. At last, we reached a backwater full of panias, and our gastronomical troubles were over. One night, by way of a change, we had a good laugh. I was awakened by a curious, half-moaning, half-hissing sound, like a phonograph running down. Presently, I distinguished the origin of the noise. Jack was muttering through his teeth from the other side of the hut. By dint of careful attention to the strange sounds he uttered, I made out the words which he was repeating in an ever-increasing agony. "For God's sake, light the light," he groaned. Roused to action by his strained appeal, I did as I was asked. Lifting his mosquito bar, I let the torchlight fall on his bed. A land crab sat on his face. It's not to be wondered at that he was afraid to move a muscle. It might have been a scorpion, a big spider, a centipede, or one of many other venomous crawling things that are always to be found around camp in tropical America. Nobody ever puts anything on without first investigating it thoroughly. If you want to avoid trouble, put a hot coal in your shoes before your feet and turn your shirt and pants inside out before trusting your limbs to them. We were within 3 or 4 days paddling of the mouth of the river when we landed one afternoon to make our mariaris for the canoe, as we should soon be out in the sunlight. Tying up to a branch as usual, we went into the forest with only our rifles and machetes. After a couple of hours' absence, we returned to the river. Of the 20-odd bowls of rubber we brought down with us, 3 were left. That was the worst shock we ever suffered on the Yasuni. The presence of any other civilized beings on its waters would have been the last thing to occur to us. Evidently, during our year's absence, someone had not been idle. Doubtless, we'd removed the hoodoo from the Yasuni ourselves, and others had ventured to follow in our wake. The first thing that occurred to us was to seize our paddles and go downstream as fast as we could to recover the dearly won fruits of a year's labour. Our feelings may be imagined. We were on the warpath. 2 hours paddling brought us in sight of an old Ecuadorian and his daughter, who, with a canoe-load of Indians, were encamped on the bank. Of them we made inquiries and learnt that a party of Colombians, the name did not evoke pleasant memories, had passed going upstream the day before but had not returned. Now, the Yasuni is a very narrow river, so we turned our canoe about. Having begged a basket of farinha, we thanked the old man for his information and set off after the thieves. Within 24 hours we sighted smoke ahead. Rounding a bend, we came upon an inlet from which it was rising. After landing, we cautiously approached the camp, which stood well back from the water's edge. We walked up to the edge of the clearing and were met by 3 Indian women of the blouse and skirt variety, evidently belonging to some party of cocheros. They had come, they said, from the Agurico. While we were talking to them, up came a tough-looking, bearded fellow of the renegade type. I held him up and disarmed him before he could recover from his surprise. Seeing another rifle and a trade gun hanging in the shack, I took possession of them also, and, leaving the cochero, thanking his lucky stars he had escaped the penalty that was his due, I turned to join Jack at the water's edge. He'd found our rubber afloat in the canoe, and a good deal more besides. When I came up, he said he didn't feel much like sorting out what was ours and what was theirs. By this time, a second Colombian had drifted in, but he did not look very dangerous, armed only with the machete as he was. Before pushing off, we gave them a few words of advice about coming up the Yasuni again, Jack putting in a particularly fine performance in English. We intimated to them that if we saw them in the woods, we should probably mistake them for monkeys. And so it happened that 2 days later we sailed out into the Napo with 2 canoes and about a ton of rubber, having left a rifle and a trade gun with the Ecuadorian for his information and his farinha. We did not profess to be saints, but we thought the old man deserved something for his trouble. After the gloom of the forest, the glare of the sun and its reflection on the water tormented us. Our scanty clothes, mere rags by this time, gave us no protection, and we were badly burned. Jack suffered more than I. He peeled off 3 or 4 skins during the fortnight which elapsed before we arrived at the Marañón. The mosquitoes and gnats were maddening too. Then we decided to travel by night and sleep in the canoe by watches during the day. But though we escaped the sun, nothing we could do was of any avail against the insects which swarmed in clouds by day and by night. Sometimes they settled on our bodies in such numbers that a black smear, a substance which might be termed mosquito paste, would be left on the hand after passing it quickly over the skin. Oh, I feel itchy just reading that. At first we tried landing at night, and it was then that I discovered a blanket vein of semi-anthracite coal, 4 feet thick, which formed part of the bank of the river. It burned well, and left a clean white ash, and indeed appeared to me to be a good quality of high-grade fuel, just the thing needed for the swarms of steamers which then plied the main rivers, and had either to pay outrageous prices for the English or American product, or stop twice a day to chop wood. The continuous hum of the mosquitoes' wings was like a distant train passing in the stillness of the night. As a final effort to keep out the sun and gnats, we landed and proceeded to carve out suits of clothes from the red calico mosquito nets. Joining the seams with rubber, spreading the material on the sand, we took our machetes and tried our hands at tailoring, with lamentable results. Jack's pattern would have done for the old times, when they wore skin-tight breeches, but not for the work we had to do. He found that he could not sit down, and had to walk stiff-legged. The only way he could board the canoe was by rolling in. In desperation, he slit the outside seams, and pasted in remnants to fill up the gaps, every one of which stuck to his hairy legs. He vowed that he had all those pieces he saw climbing a tree up the Yasuni, and would have made his shirt meet his pants. The matter was not so serious as it might have been, however, for his skin was burned to a shade that matched the calico. Back in the canoes again, we made for the Marignan. A day or two later, we were floating along, when of a sudden I saw something I had not seen since leaving Guayaquil on the Pacific, a real steamboat. We started paddling for the bank where the steamer was moored for fuel chopping, to make inquiries as to how far it was to Iquitos. As we drew alongside, I noticed that the hands who were on deck began peering at us over the rail with a great display of interest. Presently, the owner of the craft, a wealthy Peruvian cochero, put his hand over the side, and, without forgetting the inborn etiquette of his race, he called out, "I thought you were Indians at first, but now I see I'm mistaken." "You're right," I shouted. "We're Americans." At that, he invited us on board, saying that there was one of our countrymen with him, the engineer in fact. We tied up and clambered onto the deck. The first thing that caught Jack's eye was a crust of bread on the deck. To create a diversion, he fell on it as a rugby footballer throws himself on the ball. Don Luis Felipe Moret turned to the nearest sailor and ordered food to be brought up, scandalized, like a true Spaniard, at the spectacle. But without waiting for the food, I asked where the American was to be found. "Down that hatchway over there," replied D. Louis. We stuck our heads over the grating and called out, "Hello there, down below!" The engineer looked up from his work. I think he began to answer us, but in a moment he changed his mind and came running up the companionway, afraid, as he told me afterwards, that we might escape before he could get another look at us. Arrived on deck, he collapsed. Here was somebody with a sense of humour at last. He rolled around, spluttering and coughing, quite inarticulate with laughter. At last our host's solemnity broke down, and he too doubled up. To the engineer's fitful questions, I answered that we had left Quitos some 2 years back en route for New York, but had been detained upriver. "But how far is Iquitos?" I asked. "That's much more important than New York for the moment." 5 or 6 days paddling, but if you'll only go straight to New York, you'll make fortunes," came the answer. When first we looked into a mirror, a few minutes later, we were even surprised ourselves. 2 years without a haircut or a shave had left their mark, to which we had added our homemade clothes. The net result was a pair of haggard, barefoot, shaggy Rip Van Winkles in red calico. Don Philippe rose to the occasion. Our tale of woe moved him to bring out every good thing that there was to eat on board that ship. Canned sausages, Edam cheese, crackers, sugar, biscuits, beer, and a host of other things I have forgotten. Best of all was a loaf of real bread, a thing we had not tasted since leaving Quito. To cut a long story short, they did all they could for us on that steamer, giving us the board and clothes we needed so badly. As we climbed on board our canoe an hour later, the engineer made us promise to wait for him in Iquitos, where he would return in a few days' time. "You're the fellows I want to know," he called out to me as we pushed off. And then, as a final piece of advice, "Go and see Dr. X." We made Iquitos in 6 days. And that's the end of that chapter. Next one up, of course it's in reverse, but next one up is a chapter called Iquitos. Yeah. I don't have much to say. I get my first bit of rain here for what's been a good week or so of like absolutely gorgeous weather. Sorry to hear it's so fucking cold down the South Island. It's not often you'd give Ireland credit for being a warmer place, but like, been appreciating being here this last week. It's been a good place to be. Anyway, I love yous and leave yous. Start uploading this and get the next chapter started. What have we got? Oh yeah, not too long a chapter. I'm sure I can get these two down. Yeah, take care, guys. See you later. How do we do this?